But let me start off by sharing with you some facts when it comes to floods and climate change. Every time there's a natural disaster now, the climate change card is played. You know it. It's 5% meteorology and 95% politics, isn't it? When they wanted to blame the bushfires on climate change, I showed you records detailing bigger fires, earlier fires, more deadly fires, long before global warming was a factor. When they tried to blame the drought on climate change, I talked about how we had a worse drought in the 1890s. And I showed you also how scientists won't link our droughts directly to climate change. I said at the time that when the drought breaks with floods, as they often do, they'll probably blame the floods on climate change too. And so it's come to pass. We've seen bad flooding again this year in southeast Queensland, northern New South Wales and the Sydney Basin. And global warming, the blame game is on again. The green left activists, the hard left politicians and the media have all jumped on the climate change bandwagon. And sadly, rather than contest their arguments with hard facts, the Prime Minister has tried to go with the flow.
We are dealing with a different climate to the one we were dealing with before. I think that's just an obvious fact. And Australia is getting hard to live in because of these disasters.
Now, the thing here is not to get into the climate change denial game, not to deny the science and not to be alarmist. We need intelligent discussion. The aim, as always, ought to be to look at the facts and calmly address them. So let's start with the worst of the flooding this year, the one that is actually a record. In Lismore, one of the most frequently flooded cities in the country, the river peaked at a new high of more than 14 metres. That is a fact, a record high flood. Climate change could be a factor in that, or changing land use and clearing of land could have played a role, or it could be just the freakish La Nina weather event we're going through. That's for science to conclude. But it's important to look at the historical record to see if flooding is becoming more common in Lismore. And as you can see, serious floods in Lismore are regular, always have been. But you can see the highest concentration of serious floods was back in the 1870s and 1890s. 4 11-metre floods over 23 years. That was way before global warming kicked in. The last 4 floods over that level have been spread over twice as many years, 46 years. So that's some context around the Lismore flooding. It's terrible, as we know, but that's some historical context. Let's look at some other charts. When you look at Brisbane, you can see the last couple of damaging floods pale into insignificance compared to the frequency and depth of flooding in the late 19th century. And likewise, the Hawkesbury River at Windsor, northwest of Sydney, 2 years of serious flooding in a row now. Again, that's terrible, but again, the late 19th century is when the flooding really peaked in that area. Now, this doesn't downplay the trauma now. These have been terrible floods. But if we're going to blame climate change, we need to look at the history. Does this prove nothing will get worse with a warming planet? No, of course it doesn't. But it does prove that the claims things are getting demonstrably worse now already are just not accurate. As I said, they're 5% meteorology and 95% politics. Now, we know if the planet gets hotter, it will get wetter. That's basic science. So let's look at what the latest IPCC report says about weather extremes, remembering this is the Bible of the climate alarmists. There's no doubt the IPCC predicts more weather extremes, but as for what is actually happening already, it's far from conclusive because the evidence is thin. It says human influence has likely increased the chance of compound extreme events since the 1950s. This includes increases in the frequency of concurrent heat waves and droughts on the global scale, high confidence of that prediction, fire weather in some regions of all inhabited continents, medium confidence about that assessment, and compound flooding in some locations, medium confidence about that as well. So you've got medium confidence that we are likely seeing compound flooding increase around the world. The point is, to get a more accurate picture, you have to wait longer, you have to observe longer. Now, as you know, many climate predictions have been wrong. Otherwise, we'd all be still stuck in a permanent drought, as Tim Flannery said. So a lot of people here are exaggerating, if not downright fear-mongering about what is happening now because they want to push a political barrow. This is really an insult to earlier generations who battled worse or just as bad without helicopter rescues, without firebombing aircraft and without mobile phones to call out for help and get them through. But more to the point, all this alarmist stuff is a distraction. It presumes a big lie, that is, that somehow we can adjust some policies in Australia and change the weather, reduce the severity of our natural disasters. That is so ridiculous, it hardly bears rebuttal. But that's the gist of what Labor and the Greens are pushing. What's far more informative is history and weather records. They tell us we have always had bad droughts, bad floods and bad fires. And whether they get worse or not, we will always have them. So we need to be prepared to deal with them, not pretend we can carbon tax them away.